Chuck Norris has died, and for many viewers, that sad news brings back one very specific memory. Not Walker, Texas Ranger. Not the internet jokes that turned him into an unstoppable icon. But the moment he stepped into the Colosseum in Way of the Dragon, faced Bruce Lee, and became part of one of the most famous fight scenes in movie history. That is the most painful paradox in Chuck Norris's legacy. A man associated with toughness, endurance, and a nearly unbreakable image is still remembered most clearly by many people for a defeat. But the more people look back, the more they understand why that scene never disappeared. It was not just a fight. It was the moment two icons met at exactly the right time, in exactly the right place, and at exactly the moment martial arts cinema was changing into something new. But what makes this story even more worth telling after his death is that many viewers only remember the result of the fight. They do not know how Bruce Lee chose Norris, how much the crew risked, or what Norris himself had to sacrifice to turn a few minutes on screen into a sequence that has survived for more than half a century. And that is the real reason Way of the Dragon is being talked about so much again after the news of his passing. People are not just mourning an action star. They are looking back at the moment a legend began. Number 1. Bruce Lee's one-man creative empire. One of the most important facts about Way of the Dragon is that it was almost a one-man film. Bruce Lee did not just star in it. He was directly involved in nearly all of its most important positions: director, screenwriter, producer, fight choreographer, and the central face of its promotional campaign. For a Hong Kong martial arts film in the early 1970s, that level of control was extremely rare. That helps explain why Way of the Dragon has such a powerful and distinct identity. The film does not tell its story by simply stringing fight scenes together. Right from the beginning, Bruce Lee deliberately creates a main character who is awkward and even funny, then slowly leads the audience toward the climax in Rome. That shift does not happen by accident. It comes from the fact that one man was guiding nearly the entire creative direction of the film. Many people who worked with him later talked about this. Raymond Chow, the head of Golden Harvest, described Bruce Lee as someone who wanted to personally control the most important parts of a film, from story rhythm to the way the fights were edited. That gave the movie a strong sense of unity, but it also created enormous pressure, because if even one part failed, almost the entire burden fell on him. That is also why Way of the Dragon feels different from many martial arts films of the same era, where power was usually divided between the studio, the director, and the action team. Here, Bruce Lee was both the soul of the movie and the person responsible for almost every major decision. Number 2. Renamed to cash in on itself. One detail that easily confuses audiences is the film's title in the United States. Way of the Dragon was actually made before Enter the Dragon, but when it was released in the American market, the distributors changed the title to Return of the Dragon. The reason was obvious. They wanted to capitalize on the enormous heat generated by Enter the Dragon after Bruce Lee had become a global phenomenon. From a marketing standpoint, it was a very smart move. Once American audiences knew Bruce Lee as an international martial arts icon, the title Return of the Dragon sounded like a natural continuation of that excitement. It felt familiar, easier to sell, and perfectly aimed at viewers who wanted to see anything at all with Bruce Lee's name on the poster. What makes this especially interesting is that this strategy was different from the way many Asian martial arts films were brought to the US at the time. Plenty of them were re-edited, reposted, or even given an entirely different marketing tone. But Way of the Dragon is a very clear example of a film being renamed in order to pull in audiences by using the momentum of another movie's success. To put it bluntly, the American market used Bruce Lee's own brand to generate extra profit for a film that had actually been made earlier. And what makes this story even more fascinating is that even the process of shooting the movie in Europe did not happen the way audiences usually imagine. Number 3. Shooting guerrilla style at the Colosseum. When people watch the final fight between Bruce Lee and Chuck Norris, many assume the production must have had full permits, full equipment, and plenty of time to turn the Roman Colosseum into the film's central location. The truth was the opposite. According to stories told years later, the crew did not have the luxury of shooting comfortably in the Colosseum for long periods. They had to grab their wide shots very early in the morning during a very limited window, and the filming was so improvised that it was almost a matter of seizing the moment. Some accounts from people involved claim that the crew had to hide equipment in bags or backpacks to avoid drawing too much attention. John T. Benn, who played the crime boss in the movie, later recalled that the team did not have many hours to work inside one of the most famous landmarks in Rome. That means the wide shots, the frames that show the enormous scale of the Colosseum, were actually captured under very rushed conditions. But that is only the surface of the story, because anyone who assumes the entire legendary fight was shot in Rome is in for another surprise. Number 4. The classic fight was actually shot in 2 places. This is one of the details that surprises people the most. The fight between Bruce Lee and Chuck Norris was not filmed entirely in one location. The wide shots, the frames that clearly establish the Colosseum, were indeed shot in Rome. But most of the close combat, the detailed strikes, and many of the most important moments of the showdown were actually completed at Golden Harvest Studios in Hong Kong. The reason was simple. The crew had too little time in Italy. They could not stay at the Colosseum long enough to shoot the entire fight with all the retakes required for such a complex action sequence. Getting the wide angles alone was already a race against time. So the most sensible solution was to bring the backbone of the fight back to Hong Kong, where the crew had much more control over the lighting, the camera angles, and the number of takes. What makes this even more impressive is that while dealing with all of those location problems, Bruce Lee was also heading into the trip with a script that may not have even been fully finished. Number 5. The script was written on the plane. One detail that fits Bruce Lee's working style perfectly is the story that the Way of the Dragon script was completed largely during the flight from Hong Kong to Rome. This is not the image of a production that had everything neatly prepared months in advance. It feels more like a furious creative sprint, with ideas still being written after the plane had already left the runway. If that detail is accurate, as many later behind-the-scenes accounts suggest, then it tells us a great deal about the pace of the production. Bruce Lee was in an explosive creative period, but he was also under enormous time pressure. He had to shape the story, figure out how to stage the film in Rome, and prepare the fight sequences that would serve as the movie's backbone. The fact that he was still writing while traveling shows that he did not enter the project with the kind of security usually associated with a major production. Some members of the crew later recalled that Bruce Lee was constantly revising, adding, and adjusting things as the work continued. That made Way of the Dragon feel alive and flexible, but it also made the entire project extremely dependent on his instincts. Number 6. No live sound recording. One very important production detail is that Way of the Dragon was not filmed with synchronized live sound on set. That was not unusual for this film alone. It was a fairly common practice in Hong Kong cinema in the early 1970s, especially for fast-moving action films shot across multiple locations, often with more limited technical resources than large Hollywood productions of the same period. That means the actors were not creating the final sound that audiences would eventually hear in theaters while they were performing. Dialogue, shouts, impacts, hits, and many other sound effects were added later in post-production. In other words, the sounds viewers remember so vividly today, like the cries during attacks or the weight of the blows, were largely built later and not captured live in the Colosseum or on a Hong Kong set. This detail explains why the film's sound has such a distinct early 1970s Hong Kong martial arts quality. It is sharp, forceful, separated cleanly, and often pushed slightly beyond realism, so the audience feels the strikes more strongly. In a movie with as much action as Way of the Dragon, that was not just a technical choice. It was also part of its storytelling style. Number 7. Bruce Lee played the instruments himself. One of the lesser-known facts about Way of the Dragon is that Bruce Lee did not just control the visual side and the martial arts, he also had a direct hand in the music. According to many behind-the-scenes accounts, Bruce Lee actually played percussion for part of the score in order to make sure the rhythm of the music matched the rhythm of the action on screen. If you look at the way he thought about filmmaking, this makes perfect sense. Bruce Lee did not see fight scenes as just a chain of hard movements linked together. He saw them as structures with rhythm, acceleration, pauses, pressure points, and release. When the same man directing the movie and designing the fight scenes is also involved in shaping the rhythm of the soundtrack, the result gains a level of unity that many martial arts films of the time simply did not have. And that level of control extended beyond the action. Even on the villain side of the story, Bruce Lee made some very unexpected choices, including giving a major role to someone who was barely an actor at all. Number 8. The Mafia boss was a complete amateur. One very interesting part of Way of the Dragon lies in its supporting villains. John T. Benn, who played the mob boss in the film, was not a professional actor. He was an American businessman living in Hong Kong, someone known in business circles, not a trained film performer. According to the behind-the-scenes stories that have circulated for years, Bruce Lee saw something in John T. Benn that perfectly fit the role. A commanding Western look, a natural presence, and exactly the kind of face that worked for the type of gang leader the film needed. In other words, Bruce Lee chose him not because of his acting technique, but because he already had the right cinematic look for the part. His casting also shows how quickly Bruce Lee could read people. He knew when he needed a real fighter, when he needed someone with the right physical presence, and when it was more efficient to skip the usual long casting process and go with the exact type of person the role demanded. And John T. Benn was not the only surprising choice. Even the role of Colt, which later became forever linked with Chuck Norris, was not originally written for him. Number 9. Chuck Norris wasn't the first choice. The most intriguing facts for many viewers is that Chuck Norris was not the first choice to play Colt. According to the behind-the-scenes stories that have circulated widely among martial arts historians and Bruce Lee fans, the first person approached was Joe Louis, the famous karate champion. That collaboration did not happen, and Chuck Norris was then brought in instead. If that had gone differently, martial arts film history might have changed. The final fight in Way of the Dragon was not just a good scene. It was the moment that locked Chuck Norris into international film memory. Without the role of Colt, the path that took him from a respected karate champion to an on-screen action icon might have been much slower. From a dramatic standpoint, this is a fascinating case. One rejected offer behind the scenes accidentally created a matchup that became even more famous than anyone may have originally planned. Because when Chuck Norris stepped into the role of Colt, audiences did not just remember that Bruce Lee won, they remembered exactly who he had to beat. Number 10. Chuck Norris was asked to put on weight. One especially striking detail in preparation for the final fight is that Bruce Lee reportedly asked Chuck Norris to put on extra weight before filming. The goal was not to make him slower or clumsier. The goal was to create a stronger physical contrast between the two men on screen. Bruce Lee understood that film does not tell a story through punches alone. It also tells a story through body shape, posture, and the visual impression made the moment two people enter the same frame. If Colt looked bulkier, denser, and much heavier than Bruce Lee, the audience would instantly understand that this was not an ordinary opponent. Bruce Lee at the time had a compact, ultra-defined, highly efficient body. Colt needed to look thicker and more solid, like a wall the hero would have to break through. And once the opponent had been shaped in that way for the screen, their real-life relationship made the film even more interesting. Number 11. The student fought the teacher. One of the things that makes Way of the Dragon more special than many other martial arts films is that the two men Bruce Lee fights on screen, Chuck Norris and Bob Wall, were not just random performers hired to play villains. In real life, both had trained with Bruce Lee and had genuine relationships with him before they ever faced him on camera. That gives the film a completely different layer. When Bruce Lee fights Chuck Norris's Colt, or Bob Wall's Fred, it is not just actors going through mechanical choreography. These were people who already understood each other's movement styles, speed, range, and the way Bruce Lee wanted martial arts to look on screen. In action cinema, especially martial arts, that kind of real-life familiarity is a huge advantage. It helps performers coordinate more smoothly, reduces errors in close combat sequences, and most importantly, makes their reactions feel less artificial. When two people have already trained together, they read each other's movement faster. That becomes especially useful in scenes that must be repeated over and over while still looking precise. Number 12. The unplanned actor, a stray cat. One of the small details in Way of the Dragon that audiences remember surprisingly well is the cat in the Colosseum. This was not some prop prepared weeks in advance. According to the behind-the-scenes stories that have been told over the years, it was a real stray cat in Rome, and Bruce Lee decided to include it in the scene as part of the atmosphere before the final showdown. At first glance, it seems like nothing more than a background detail, but placed at exactly the right moment, the cat does something important. It makes the ancient setting of the Colosseum feel less like a constructed backdrop and more like a living, breathing space. That brief appearance creates a beautiful contrast. One small, ordinary creature wandering through just before two martial artists enter a fight to the death. From a staging perspective, it was a very smart choice. Bruce Lee does not raise the tension immediately with loud shouting or heavy music. Instead, he lets the audience observe the place itself, feel the silence, and only then realize the confrontation is getting closer. The cat becomes a tiny visual marker, but it adds tension and memorability to the scene. Number 13. No kiss at all. One thing that feels unusual when looking back at Way of the Dragon is that even though Bruce Lee was once again acting opposite Nora Miao, the film never pushes their relationship into a clearly romantic direction. There is no kiss. There is no passionate love story. There is none of the romantic softening that many action or martial arts films use to round out the male hero. That was a deliberate choice. Bruce Lee built Tang Lung very differently from the angry, driven, emotionally intense figure he played in Fist of Fury. Here, Tang Lung is more naive, more out of place in Rome, and often used for comedy in the first half of the movie. Because of that, refusing to force the male-female relationship into a romantic formula helps the character maintain the film's unique tone. Compared to Fist of Fury, the contrast is clear. In the earlier film, the relationship with the female character carried much more tragedy and emotional weight. In Way of the Dragon, Bruce Lee clearly did not want romance to push too deeply into the structure of the film. He kept the focus on the conflict with the gangsters, Tang Lung's awkwardness as a foreigner in Rome, and finally, the great battle in the Colosseum. Number 14. A showcase of Jeet Kune Do philosophy. If someone wanted a single scene from Way of the Dragon that could explain Bruce Lee's Jeet Kune Do philosophy to people who had never read his writing or heard him discuss it, the fight with Chuck Norris would be the clearest example. This is not just a scene where two fighters battle. It is a very specific demonstration of the way Bruce Lee thought about martial arts. Never trapped inside rigid systems, never blindly loyal to one style, and always willing to adapt to the opponent in front of him. In the fight itself, Tang Lung does not dominate from the beginning. He has to observe Colt, feel the distance, and absorb the pressure of his opponent's strength and durability. The crucial thing is that Bruce Lee does not stage the fight as a simple, overpowering victory. He lets the audience see his character adjust. When Tang Lung is still moving too directly and too stiffly, he does not clearly control the match. Only when he starts moving more loosely, changing the rhythm of his entries and exits, and responding to the situation in real time, does the balance shift. That is Jeet Kune Do in pure form. No attachment to fixed form. No blind loyalty to rigid systems. Efficiency as the standard, adaptability as the principle. That is what makes the Colosseum fight different from many martial arts films of the same period, where the hero often wins simply by hitting harder, moving faster, or having more power. Here, victory comes from reading the opponent and changing strategy at the right moment. Number 15. The first double nunchaku performance. In Way of the Dragon, Bruce Lee did not just continue to associate himself with nunchaku. He raised it to another level by performing with double nunchaku in the alley fight scene. That detail matters a great deal, because it marks the first time on screen that Bruce Lee showed audiences his ability to control two nunchaku at once. From a cinematic standpoint, it is an incredibly powerful image. That one moment alone is enough to separate the scene from the rest of the movie. It is not just a display of technique. It transforms the nunchaku from an unusual weapon into a symbol permanently tied to Bruce Lee in the minds of international audiences. After the film, the image of Bruce Lee wielding nunchaku spread rapidly and directly affected popular culture. And it is important to understand that this was not some pointless flourish added just to look flashy. Bruce Lee understood that audiences needed unforgettable visual moments, and the double nunchaku was exactly that. It stunned viewers instantly, because very few people had ever seen a movie star control that weapon with such speed and precision. In the context of the early 1970s, it was a cultural explosion. Many martial arts movies of the time featured swords, staffs, spears, or bare hands, but very few created such a strong visual identity as Bruce Lee with nunchaku. And once he pushed that into double nunchaku, the impact became even bigger. Of course, that impact had consequences too. The scene made such a powerful impression that some censorship boards in Europe began to see it as a serious problem. Number 16. Heavily censored in Britain. The popularity of the nunchaku in Way of the Dragon did not just create excitement. It also triggered a strong reaction from censorship authorities, especially in Britain and in parts of Europe. In the eyes of regulators at the time, this was no longer just a martial arts detail. It was an image that young audiences might imitate very quickly. This has to be understood in the context of the early 1970s. Bruce Lee was not just a movie star. He was becoming a cultural phenomenon. The way he attacked, the sounds he made, the hand movements, and especially the nunchaku were all being copied by young people in streets, schoolyards, and gyms. That is why some European censors argued that leaving those nunchaku scenes intact on the big screen might increase the risk of real-world imitation and violence. As a result, the film was cut in certain markets. That is a major difference between Bruce Lee's films and many other action movies of the same era. Not every film was scrutinized so carefully at the level of weapon imagery and social influence. In this case, the nunchaku was not seen as just entertainment. It was seen as something that could step off the screen and into real life. And the irony is that the censorship itself proved just how powerful Bruce Lee's influence had become. If those scenes had not been that strong, they would never have been treated so seriously. The film did not just succeed in theaters. It also forced cultural institutions in places far from Hong Kong to respond to it. Number 17. The meaning of the name. Tang Lung. The hero's name in Way of the Dragon was not chosen at random. Tang Lung is often understood as meaning something close to Chinese dragon, and that matters if you look at the way Bruce Lee was building his screen identity. He did not just want the hero to be strong. He wanted the hero to represent Chinese cultural pride in a much broader international context. That is especially important because Way of the Dragon moves the story out of Hong Kong and places it in Rome. When a character with a name tied to the image of the Chinese dragon enters a Western setting, the film is doing more than telling a gang-fighting story. It is placing an Eastern symbol in the center of an international screen in a very direct way. Bruce Lee repeatedly expressed a desire to change the way Asians were seen on film. Before his rise, many Western films treated Asian characters as side figures, exotic curiosities, or weak types. In Way of the Dragon, Tang Lung is not placed in that role. He arrives in Rome, looks awkward in some situations, but ultimately becomes the man who resolves the entire conflict through his own skill. Number 18. Absolute respect for martial arts. One of the most talked about moments at the end of the Colosseum fight is not the final kick or the deciding lock. It is the moment when Tang Lung picks up Colt's GI and places it over his body after the fight is over. It is a very brief moment, but its meaning is far larger than its screen time. On the level of storytelling, that gesture completely changes the feeling of the ending. If Bruce Lee had simply beaten Colt and walked away, the fight would still be impressive. But by showing respect to his fallen opponent, he lifts the scene beyond a simple victory and defeat. It becomes a confrontation between two real martial artists. The winner does not humiliate the loser. The winner acknowledges the value of the man he defeated. That is very different from many action films of the same era, where the villain is destroyed in triumph or treated like someone whose punishment should be satisfying. Colt is not handled that way. Even though he stands on the opposing side of the film's structure, he is still given a dignified ending. That one detail is a huge part of why Chuck Norris's character stayed in audiences' memories for so long. Number 19. An almost unreal box office record. If you look at it from a business standpoint, Way of the Dragon tells an almost unbelievable story. The production budget was relatively modest, often estimated at around $130,000 in period dollars. But after release, the film exploded and is widely said to have earned around $130 million worldwide. Exact calculations and reporting from that era are not always as standardized as they are now, but the distance between cost and return was still enough to make the movie a profit phenomenon. That number matters because it proves Bruce Lee was not just creating cultural influence, he was also creating commercial results on a scale that forced film companies to pay attention. A martial arts movie produced in Hong Kong, shot partly in Europe, and made without a Hollywood-sized budget, was able to generate a worldwide sensation. That was not easy to do in the early 1970s. Compared to many action films of the same era, Way of the Dragon achieved a nearly extraordinary level of profitability. It proved that Asian martial arts cinema was no longer just a niche market product. Bruce Lee turned it into a cultural commodity that could be sold across Asia, Europe, and eventually America. Number 20. An immortal monument. The final thing that has to be said about Way of the Dragon is that the film did not just leave behind a famous fight. It left behind a standard. The showdown between Bruce Lee and Chuck Norris in the Colosseum has spent decades appearing in rankings of the greatest fight scenes ever filmed, from mainstream movie magazines to martial arts publications like Empire and Black Belt. Martial arts cinema has produced many fights that are faster, louder, or more technically complex. But the Colosseum battle in Way of the Dragon still holds a unique place because it has both symbolic power and a direct visual clarity that mainstream audiences never forget. Viewers may forget the names of supporting characters in the film, but they almost never forget Chuck Norris stepping into the arena, taking off his shirt, and facing Bruce Lee in that gigantic ancient stone setting. After Bruce Lee's death, the scene came to be seen as a piece of history that could never happen again. And now, after Chuck Norris's passing as well, that famous loss carries a different meaning too. It is no longer just the moment Bruce Lee defeated a powerful opponent. It is also the moment the world's enduring version of Chuck Norris was born. When people look back at Way of the Dragon today, what makes it more painful than before is not simply that it is one of Bruce Lee's classics. What makes it heavier now is that the fight in the Roman Colosseum has become a place that preserves the image of both legends. Bruce Lee has been gone for a very long time, and now Chuck Norris too has closed his journey at the age of 86. One is remembered as a symbol of speed, the other as a symbol of strength, and both are forever tied to a few minutes of film that have lasted for more than half a century. My sincere condolences go to Chuck Norris's family, friends, and fans all over the world. The legacy he leaves behind is not only in the roles that came later, but also in the very moment when he stepped into a fight the whole world is still talking about today. Out of all the secrets behind Way of the Dragon, which detail surprised you the most? Leave it in the comments so we can honor Chuck Norris together and look back at his special role in this film. And if you want me to keep digging into behind-the-scenes truths, untold moments, and film legacies that are still debated even now, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the bell.